Good afternoon to all of you. I welcome you to the second pre-conference webinar for the 5th World Congress on Disaster Management. It is titled Legal and Institutional Framework of Disaster Management in Context of COVID-19. I am Abhijit Dwivedi. I am presently working as an assistant professor at a Special Center for Disaster Research, JNU. And my field of work is in basically law, constitutional law, international law, and the issues of governance related to disasters. I will take this opportunity to briefly introduce DEMICS and SCDR. DEMICS stands for Disaster Management Initiative and Convergence Society. It is a civil society initiative which was started in 2005. It has grown from a think tank to that of a community-centric organizations, and it serves as a convergence society for decision makers, practitioners, and experts on disaster risk reduction. They have been organizing a series of programs and initiatives for a very long period of time. SCDR, that is my parent institution, it stands for Special Center for Disaster Research. It is at Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is the premier university situated in the capital of India, that is Delhi. This is a transdisciplinary center which is established at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and it is one of its own kind of center which extends beyond the rigidity of one field and analyzes disasters from the discipline of social science, law, from the angle of governance, institutions, and sciences as well. Before handing over the mic to the Dr. PG Dhar Chakravarti sir for moderation ahead, I would like to briefly introduce sir. He is a very renowned officer, and he is a retired officer of Indian Administrative Services and was involved in disaster and climate risk reduction at the national, international, and global level for over 1.5 decades. He had headed National Institute of Disaster Management as its executive director, National Disaster Management Authority as its secretary, and SARC Disaster Management Center as its founder director. He was involved with several expert groups of UNISDR, UNICHA, UNFCCC, CCC, and was nominated by the UN Secretary General as member of the advisory group of Central Emergency Response Fund. He is the chairman of the Scientific and Technical Committee of the 5th World Congress on Disaster Management. I welcome all the esteemed guests, and with this, I hand over the floor to Dr. PG Dhar Chakravarti. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you. Thank you. So today we have a very distinguished panelist of parliamentarians, legal luminaries, academicians, and also policymakers at the national level and also at the global level. So deliberating on a very important subject of legal and institutional framework of disaster management in the context of the COVID-19. Now, this legal framework on disaster management in most of the countries, it has taken place only very recently. You know, Japan was probably the first country to have enacted its laws in 1947, and thereafter they modified it in 1966. The United States, the Stafford Creek Act, it came up in much later in 1988. And in other countries, which is basically, it is a post-tsunami phenomena. You know, that's 2 weeks after the Indian Ocean tsunami. We had this World Conference on Disaster Management that adopted the Hyogo framework for action. And one of the priorities, in fact, the very first priority of this Hyogo framework of action was for the countries to develop legal institutional framework for disaster management, which was missing in most of the countries. So soon thereafter, you find countries one after another, they framed their disaster management laws. In South Asia, Sri Lanka was the first to do it. In June 2015, India did it 6 months after, on the first anniversary of on the Boxing Day of the tsunami, the Disaster Management Act 2005. And 6 months thereafter, Pakistan came up with this, I think a little later, I think after the earthquake of October 2006, Pakistan came up with this, you know, disaster management ordinance. Bangladesh came in 2012, and you know, Philippines came in 2010. So these are recent developments, all these institutions and all the laws on disaster management. So initially, these, you know, in 2005, 6, 7, all the acts that came up, it focused on the, you know, disasters caused by the natural hazards and to some extent by technological hazards. And after the IPCC came up with this, you know, 4th assessment report in 2007, the countries tried to include the climate risk management as also part of the Disaster Management Act. So that's why the Philippines, we find a very elaborate, you know, inclusion of the climate risk management in the legislative system. Bangladesh, even though it came up in 2010, but Bangladesh laws interestingly had a provision from the pandemic, which I think in our law didn't have it. The question is that when this pandemic came, so the countries in the region, in most of the countries we find, some of the advanced countries of the West, of course, had some kind of legislative framework. For example, the United States of America, it had in 2006 enacted the Pandemic and the All Hazard Preparedness Act. Canada had the Emergency Act of 1988 and Emergency Management of 2007. And the United Kingdom, they had the Public Health Act. And so they had there some kind of national legislations on public health emergencies to deal with these situations. Whereas in countries like India and South Asia and other countries, Southeast Asia, who didn't have a legislative system. So we, depended on our very antiquated act, Epidemics Act, and it was passed during the colonial time, 1897 Act. We used that act, and then we depended to a large extent on the Disaster Management Act. So we depended on the Disaster Management Act basically on the regulatory provisions, all the regulations and sometimes penal provisions. We used it, but the other provisions like the preparatory preparation or prevention or mitigation, these aspects of these pandemics, these are not covered adequately in the act. So we found there's kind of a legal vacuum. So the countries have started now thinking that whether the Disaster Management Act, which is about 15 years old, 10, 15 years old for the countries, are adequate for dealing with this kind of emergency situation in a very uncertain world, because things are so uncertain. How do you manage, guys, in a risk in an uncertain environment? Or these acts required substantial changes, or a new kind of legislations are required for dealing with these situations. In India, for example, there is already an act in law called Public Health Prevention, Control and Management of Epidemics, Bioterrorism and Disasters Bill, which has already been drafted, and it is before the Parliament. It was drafted in 2007, but it has not been in the parliamentary agenda as yet. So the issues for consideration in today is very, very important, very, very significant. The issue is that whether what is the experience of the countries in dealing with this kind of pandemics within the framework of the existing legal and the institutional system. Do you need to revisit this framework? Does this framework require substantial modification, changes, or do you require a new set of legislations like in other countries they have done it, specialized legislations for dealing with this situation? So this is what we are going to deliberate in the today's sessions. So we have, as I said, very distinguished panel. We'll have some kind of national perspective from three countries. We'll have a regional and the global perspective from the UNDRR, and we have a perspective from from the practitioner's point of view, from the legal luminous, and then director of the Indian Law Institute. I hope you'll be joining soon. And we have an advocate, Mr. Bansal, who has been practicing, and he has been, working on the Disaster Management Act for several years. So he's also there to throw his vision and perspective. So let me first of all invite Major General Manoj Kumar Bindal. Manoj Kumar Bindal is an officer of the Indian Army who is now heading the National Institute of Disaster Management, and is in charge of the training and capacity building for disaster management in the country. So Mr. Bindal has a very, very rich and very diverse experiences working in the Army, working in the UN peacekeeping forces. He was the director of the Center for UN United Nations Peacekeeping in Delhi. He was Provost Marshal of UN mission in Mozambique. He handled various disasters, most important being the Kashmir flood in 2017. He was in charge of that for dealing with the response and the rescue and the relief operations. So he's coming with a very rich experiences. So let me invite Major General Bindal to give his perspective from Indian perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Chakravarti, and it's a very proud moment that we are discussing such an important issue and on such an important platform. And we have such a large array of esteemed panelists who have come, who are experts in their own field, who will be discussing this issue. I will talk about, in the first part, about how India used the existing provisions effectively to cater to the pandemic, And I'll also give you an example of one state, how they also adapted themselves for the same. And towards the second part of the discussions, when we'll discuss further review that is required, I'll talk about what uh, what are the shortcomings, or what should be added to the existing DM Act. So in the first part, I'm only talking about how India tackled the whole situation. We are aware that the emergency response to the COVID-19 has been very prompt and comprehensive, not only at the national level but also at the states level, as many states have also issued necessary orders, directions, advisories, guidance notes, guidelines, statutes, or otherwise, and have taken and are taking steps to mitigate the huge impact that this deadly pandemic has unleashed in the world. So the well-established statutory instruments of the Indian Penal Code 1860, the Code of Criminal Procedure 1973, and specific legislation such as National Disaster Management Act of 2005, Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, among others, provisions have been effectively used to not only issue statutory guidelines and orders, but also ensure that the emergency responses are effective and issued in the best interest of the population at large. We are aware that in addition to the documents which I mentioned, we had the National Disaster Management Policy of 2009 and the National Policy on Disaster Management 2019. They were also made use of. And the early warnings were issued, however, in the form of travel advisory as early as 17th of January in 2020. And the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So several travel advisories were issued for people visiting China with regard to avoiding non-essential travels. And thereafter, guidelines were issued for specimen collection, packaging, transport, etc., through the Indian Council of Medical Research, ICMR, in late January 2020. The first comprehensive advisory was issued on 4th February by the National Disaster Management Authority and was followed by another which was guiding all the states and agencies in terms of preparedness and measures that were essential for containing the immense potential impact of the COVID-19. Cabinet Secretary also wrote to all the secretaries and the ministries and departments regarding detailed tasks to be undertaken by each ministry. Thereafter, a slew of measures in the form of policy documents, statutory notifications, office memos, orders, guidelines, strategy documents, letters, guidance notes, advisories, plans, departmental orders, ordinance, standard operating procedures, instructions, then FAQs, general measures, public notice have been issued from various ministries. For example, the Human Resource Department issued letters regarding school children and awareness and advisories on suspension of foreign nationals to enter India. So office memorandums were issued. 15th Finance Commission also issued the budgetary allocation for the State Disaster Risk Management Fund and the institutional arrangement to disperse and utilize such funds, which including various approved items, as well as exemptions that thereof. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare issued SOPs to handle international cruise ships at major ports, then guidelines for mask, home quarantine, empowerment, then preparedness under Section 10 of the DM Act, as well as the delegated powers to the Secretary to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare under Section 69 of the DMA was enacted. And Secretary of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare was made the nodal agency to deal with the pandemic. And there were also many letters related to social distancing to the states and they were advised to take the support of various legislations such as the Epidemic Act, the DM Act, the IPC, CRPC, and the OMs on restricting passenger movement or immigration through the various checkposts or otherwise. So the Essential Commodities Act was also brought into play, and quality distribution of masks and other medical equipment were ensured through that particular route. And revised strategy was issued by the ICMR then detailed SOPs on social distancing, closure of schools, postponing of exams. They kept on getting repeated and kept on getting improved as per the situation on ground. Uh, Also, advisories on dealing with disaster management under Section 33 of the DM Act, medical examination, role of NGOs, etc., on clinical management of COVID-19, discharge policy. So all these issues were addressed by the government through various notifications, guidelines, all the office documents that we have. Uh, Preventive measures were given that time. The Drugs and Cosmetic Act was brought into, was made use of. Then for handling and treatment of disposal of the waste as per the Central Pollution Control Board. So there were letters written to hours of work, exceptions, senior citizens, marginalized groups. So all of them were looked at. Ministry of Shipping issued so many orders at that point of time. Then testing in private laboratories, helpline numbers, river ports, land ports, all of them were covered. So there was no area which was left uncovered by the central government. And all the ministries were given adequate freedom to impose restrictions, keeping in view the broader guidelines being laid down by the central government. Then there were directives on telemedicine practice through the use of Drugs and Cosmetics Act. Then we had also preparing plans for emergency response, which was also called the Environment and Social Commitment Plan, ESCP guidelines on deployment of medical officers in airports, clarifying the medicines for chronic diseases and its uses. So all these issues were given. And then there were several advisories which were issued regarding functioning of SDM, state disaster management authorities, state emergency operation centers were issued. Then Ministry of Mines has issued letters allowing use of district mineral fund for COVID-19 containment plan, model micro plans for different details in terms of geography. So large number of steps were ensured where guidance was given, where proper financing instruments were suggested, given, where various restrictions were placed where required, and otherwise freedom was given for everyone to place additional restriction or not to place additional restriction. Also such type of advisories came out. Advisories on quarantine measures had come out. So guidelines have been issued by Ayurvedic Ministry of Ayush also. So central government continued to issue several office memorandums, letters, and consolidated guidelines on many other issues, which was also an integrated government online training, security to doctors, and which when it reached Supreme Court, they permitted and prohibited activities across the industries and prohibition of religious congregation, and the fact that any such violation will be dealt with the DM Act and the IPC. So time and again, exceptions have been granted in this whole process. So similarly, there have been letters taking the strength from the Honorable Supreme Court's order of 8th April 2020 to provide policy security to doctors, directions with regard to trained counselors, community leaders, then other advisories relating to ensuring safe drinking water, protection of senior citizens. So many of these issues were issued, including delineating the containment plan and identification of hotspots, weekly containment measures, designating red zones, orange zones, and green zones. So there were also guidelines issued so that the scheduled tribes do not suffer, and there was guidelines on collection of minor forest produce by the scheduled tribes, and also relief to plantations, plantation workers, and plantation owners. And so there was all the sections were looked at in the various issues which were addressed. Thereafter, we have seen even the states. In the states also, they took their own responses in the whole area. I'll just give you an example of, let's say, how Andhra Pradesh started responding. So we have seen that various states responded to the pandemic in their own wisdom. taking strength from the central directive and also on their own strength due to the available legal instruments, as well as creatively utilizing old instruments both at the center as well as the state laws. So the DMA, Disaster Management Act 2005, the Epidemics Act 1897, as well as the power to issue specific regulations thereunder, and the creative use of public health acts and enacting new legislation through the ordinance route uh, unfolded itself. And then we had uh, like example I'll give of Andhra Pradesh. So Andhra Pradesh, what they did, they chose to assign responsibilities to the urban local bodies and panchayats for effective management and implementation of the guidelines relating to COVID-19. And separate committees were constituted to keep track and provide technical assistance with regard to various guidelines and orders which were issued by the central government. So the state had initially allowed operation of religious places by making a distinction between major religious places and minor religious places. However, later it imposed complete implementation of the Ministry of Home Affairs guidelines, which issued with the lockdown notification. So interestingly, the state constituted state-level committee for death audit to analyze the trends and use of data to predict future trends and planning for management strategies and suggest measures to reduce the mortality rate due to COVID-19. So on the whole, the state has been compliant with the central government directive, and apart from the conflicts enumerated, the state does not pose any chance of deviation as per the current evaluation. And hence the whole thing was done in a very congruent manner where the state, not only this state, all the states and the center worked together, worked synchronously, worked hand in hand, and were able to contain the rapid, the devastating effects of the COVID-19. So here I will end right now as that how India used the various laws, existing laws to cater to the pandemic. We are aware, like in UK, they didn't have a law for disaster management. So what they did, they came out with a UK coronavirus law and made it valid only for 6 months. And it was a new law under which everything was brought under its control. They didn't have a issue like DM Act that we have. And then they kept on extending its reach through a legislation. So that was also one of the ways it could have been done. Like it was brought down by Dr. Chakravarti, that not every country had a disaster management act in place. Few countries had, and few countries, they took measures as it was, they deemed it necessary. But everyone was successful in their own way, keeping the demography and the terrain and the type of cultures prevailing in every country. So I will finish here, and thanks, and back to you, Dr. Chakravarti.
Thank you so much. So Indian experience is that India is a large country, is a federal country. We have government at various levels, and we use not only the Disaster Management Act, but host of other legislative system to manage this coronavirus. So the very rich experience that India has. So my next speaker would be another national perspective, Mr. Sabir Hussain Chaudhary. Mr. Sabir Hussain Chaudhary, are you online, please? Yes.
Yes, I am.
So, Mr. Chaudhary is a very distinguished, very dynamic, and very articulate member of Parliament, Bangladesh Parliament, and he is representing the Dhaka 9 constituency for the 4th consecutive year, and he is currently also the honorary president of the International Parliamentary Union (IPU) based in Geneva, which represents the parliamentarians of 169 countries all over the world, representing about 45,000 members of parliament. So he is very, very dynamic, and he initiated very path-breaking legislations in Bangladesh on biodiversity, on climate change, and also for the lepers. And Mr. Chaudhary is also, he is a graduate of the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London, and he holds a joint honors degree in economics and political science, as well as a diploma in law from the University of Westminster. He has been taking a very, very active interest in the on disaster management, disaster risk reduction, and the United Nations has has made him this there's a champion, the champion of disaster risk reduction in the Asia Pacific region. So we are very keen to listen to you. I know Mr. Chaudhary is a very, very busy person, but still we are grateful to you that you have spared some time to join our session. So let us hear the experience of Bangladesh in dealing with the coronavirus within the framework of the Bangladeshi legal system. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Chakrabarty. And thanks again for the very kind introduction, completely undeserved, if I may say so. And greetings to everyone, the new friends that I'm seeing today. And also great to see Marco, who has recently taken over the ropes of UN DRR in Bangkok. And we have already been working with him to see how we can inject some new life and dynamism. I was listening very closely to Mr. Bindal, and I think, the whole COVID situation has challenged governments across the subcontinent in an unprecedented way. And so it wasn't just disasters, because it was, disasters in the past, the way we have seen them is they have been localized. One part of Bangladesh may have been affected by a typhoon or a cyclone. So this is disaster on not just a global scale, but also on a national scale for the countries. So it was the scale of the challenge, I think, is what tested us the most. And of course, when we look at the Sendai framework, which Dr. Chakrabarty were talking about, Hyogo, the successor is Sendai. The Sendai framework was all about reducing existing risk and not creating new risk. That was the whole idea of Sendai. And because of that, we were moving away from managing disasters to managing risks. So there's a big difference. So it was a much more proactive sort of approach, rather than fold our hands and wait for a disaster to strike and then leap into action with relief and rehabilitation. Try to understand the risk and prevent the impacts in the first place. So that's what Sendai was about. And I think what we saw in COVID in Bangladesh, and I don't want to go through a list of the measures, because I think all of the countries have taken all of the legal, the environmental, the political, the social, institutional measures, because it was literally an all-of-government approach. So there wasn't one single ministry that was looking after it. I think, all of the ministries came together. But the important lessons, I think, first is how we view disasters going into the future, because that is going to shape how we fashion our legislation and how we articulate our policies. So one is that the disaster, this one, has been on a national scale. It's not just a district of Bangladesh or a part of Bangladesh or the coastal area of Bangladesh. Secondly, I think what we also saw is that we have now moved to a time when we have multiple hazards coming and striking at the same time. And let me explain a little as to what I mean by that. It wasn't just, the COVID. We also had flooding, we had typhoons. So all of these disasters coming together. So this is really the time of multi-hazards. It's not a single hazard. And so that again has huge implications in terms of capacity of the governments, in terms of the governance mechanisms in place, and also in terms of the strain that it puts on financial resources. The third area, which I think we have learned big time, is that, although Sendai talks about pandemics, it talks about biological health, and we all signed up, and I'm admitting that even in Bangladesh, I don't think we gave enough importance to epidemics and biological hazards. Because Sendai was really, if you look at how Sendai differs, one is, of course, in terms of managing risk rather than disasters, in terms of scaling up, in terms of looking at all kinds of events, slow onset events, frequent, infrequent, the whole range. And the third dimension, of course, was the biological and epidemic. And we did not really pay enough attention to that. So we were caught off guard. And this, when it struck, you didn't really have a time to think about the risk, because it was also rapid, also swift. And so we went back to the traditional approach, ironically, of disasters in terms of managing it, because you didn't really have the time to assess the risk, to understand the risk, to differentiate the risk, and then take action. So in a way, it was taking us back to Hyogo, because that was not so much about risk, it was a management and looking at disasters. So I think that those are the three major lessons that we have had. And also the whole domain of public health. Public health, I think, whether it is Bangladesh, India, or the subcontinent, generally we have tried to, over the years, focus more on what I refer to as medicinal health. When you talk about health in context of South Asia or even of Bangladesh, we talk about numbers of doctors, we talk about numbers of nurses, we talk about how many ICUs we have, how many hospital beds we have. But the whole domain of public health, which is about the quality of life, whether it is air pollution, whether it is COVID, whether it is tobacco control. And public health is so closely linked to prevention. The whole concept of prevention, which is at the heart of disaster risk management. I think that is really the big wake-up call. And what are we going to do in terms of coming up with, certainly one is legislation on public health. We don't really have that in Bangladesh. We also have the challenge of having a number of government ministries and institutions who are actually responding to public health. So you have the local government who's dealing with it. You have the Ministry of Health. Now also we have the Ministry of Environment. So how do countries in South Asia respond to public health? Because this is all really within the framework of public health, whether it is a pandemic or whether it is something else. So I think that has been a huge wake-up call. And once we have the legislation in place, or before we have the legislation in place, we really have to have a very clear public health policy, which is to deal with the population in its entirety. I'm not sure what other countries in South Asia have done, but in Bangladesh, this is now a huge priority and a huge challenge. And then, of course, the next is funding for it. How do we have the appropriate funding for public health? How do we raise the awareness level of people? And I think, the biggest challenge that we all have, whether we are working as parliamentarians, whether you're working in governments, is how do we change public attitudes, mindsets, behaviors? I think this is something which is huge. Bangladesh has had outstanding success when it comes to early warning systems, when it comes to community-based adaptation, when it comes to moving people to cyclone shelters. Those required a number of years. Even we had to look at the design of our cyclone shelters. We realized that just having cyclone shelter for people wasn't enough, because a lot of people in the villages, they depend on their, on their livelihoods. They depend on the poultry, they depend on their dairy, on the cows, on the goats. So we also had to move the livestock, and we had to redesign our cyclone shelters, where the ground level was for the livestock and the upper levels were for the people. So I think this is now going to be a huge challenge. And I think this is where political leadership, very clear messaging, trust and confidence of the people on the political leadership are all going to come into play. We can talk about, having all of the legislation in place, but a legislation is only as good as the extent to which it is implemented. And I think for implementation, you need to have a whole of government, a whole of society approach going forward. So I think when we talk about what are the lessons we have learned and how do we face the future, given that it is going to be a future of multi-hazards, all hazards coming at the same time, it is going to be a time of the disasters hitting us on a national level. It is going to be a time when we have to relook at public health. We have to understand public health. We have to get the public on board. We have to change behaviors. We have to change mindsets. I mean, just think of COVID. Certainly in Bangladesh, and I'm sure it's the same in India, Sri Lanka, other countries. When someone is ill, the first thing you do is you go and see them. You embrace them. The physical contact is very important. The compassion, the empathy is very important. But in COVID, you have to do completely the different thing. You can't even visit someone when they have become ill. You can't take food for them. You can't take fruits for them. So this is, I think, the biggest challenge we now have moving forward. And I think it is not just legislative frameworks. It is a whole lot of other issues that we have to see. Legislative frameworks, of course, critically important. Sendai also says that. And it acknowledges the role of parliamentarians to promote these legislative frameworks, to build them in their own countries. But the frameworks do not operate in a vacuum. The frameworks have to take into account the realities. And they have to understand that unless you can carry the people with you, unless they are at the same page as the government in terms of the challenges and the behavioral changes required, it's going to be very difficult just to shift the compass or the needle on the basis of legislation. Thank you, and I'd be happy to engage in the Q&A later on. Thank you again, and thank you for the invitation.
Sir, you are mute, sir, mute. Sir, you are on mute, sir.
Thank you so much, and thanks for your excellent overview of the situation of Bangladesh. You have very rightly pointed out that legal and institutional framework is not enough. What is enough is the whole of society approach. But you should also have a system, a legal system and an institutional system, which facilitates the involvement of the communities, facilitates the involvement of the all. Sometimes what has happened in the Disaster Management Act, it has compartmentalized disaster management. By creating a new institution, many countries, they think that it is the responsibility of that particular institution. So the whole of government in a crisis situations like pandemic has worked wonderfully in some of the countries. But in normal situation, we find that disaster management is a bit of a compartmentalization, and the whole of government approach is sometimes not working. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And now, while we wait this Ms. Cheryl joining from Philippines, she hasn't joined as yet. May I request Marcos now? Marcos is to give a regional and a global perspective. He is representing the UNDRR. Now he is the chief of the regional office of the Asia and the Pacific of the UNDRR, United Nations Office for the Disaster Risk Reduction. He is a member of the board of advisors of the least developed countries, landlocked developed countries, and small landlocked developing countries and small island developing states, to the 75th president of the UN General Assembly. Previously, he was the chief of the UNDRR liaison office in New York, and he supported the drafting of the negotiations of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction in 2015 to 30, and as secretary of the Bureau of the Third World Nations on disaster risk reduction. He also served as a secretary to the General Assembly working group on indicators and terminology relating to disaster risk reduction. I happen to be a member of the expert group which initially drafted that terminology in that report, and subsequently it went to the open working group for further analysis of that. He served as an advisor to the special rapporteur on the protection of persons in the event of disasters of the UN International Law Commission, and the development of the draft treaty on the protection of persons in the event of disasters. So he holds a degree of law from the University of Bologna, Italy. So he has a legal background, and he has a long association with disaster management, and he's in charge of the 68 countries of the Asia Pacific region. So we want to hear from Marco how the countries have fared, how the countries have used their existing legal system for dealing with the pandemics. Did you find that there are some shortcomings in that which warrant a relook into the legal institutional system? Over to you, Marcos.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chakrabarty, for your very kind introduction and for having me here today with all of you. Is a fantastic panel. I'm really humbled already by your framing, by the framing of Honorable Chaudhry, and of course by the Major General. I mean, it's really impressive what you have been already put on the table. So I'll try to be on par, like like you. I would say that the number of measures that are already Major General has outlined, and as also Honorable Chaudhry clearly indicated, there's been an incredible amount of measures that have been taken across all countries, and I will come back to that, because for me there was an incredible sign of vitality that our system have demonstrated in such challenging and limiting circumstances. I think that from what we have been learning now from the pandemic, has also been hinted, the pandemic, if we need it, really has taught us once and again that risk is systemic. there is no such thing as risk divided across sectors. Risk is systemic, and it cascades across sectors and of business sectors and society, as well as, of course, across the borders, with major impact of economic, social, environmental, and political nature. So that is the first things that it was captured in the Sendai framework, but I think that now, regrettably, we have been really shown what that means in practical terms. And also, it emerged how relevant normative frameworks, and by normative I mean not only laws, but also the regulations, the policies, the different bylaws that the countries have taken at the central level as well as the local level, were not necessarily fully suited to guide the management of risk in a systemic manner. And then we'll come back to that point. And in that connection, there was a recognition that biohazard were not necessarily adequately considered, and the system revealed silos and interoperability challenges when trying to interact. But at the same time, we can also see how goodwill in many instances prevailed and made the systems work. So an incredible recognition to people to make institutions and legislation work within the frame that we had at the beginning of the crisis. Also, what we have learned is that health crisis on one side and disasters were not necessarily looked at different dimensions of the same problem. So here is an issue of also mindset, as also Honorable Chaudhry was referring to. So learning more and more what this systemic approach really means and is something that we really need to commit more to it. And we had also, for instance, an interesting examples on the suitability of a social safety net or business safety nets in that respect. One thing that for me is incredibly interesting is that countries were extremely ready to set up ad hoc governance bodies to enhance national coordination mechanisms, task forces, you name it, precisely to try to drive a whole of state institutions, so beyond even the executive, to really drive action in the best coordinated ways as possible. And the things that we are seeing, but I think that the lessons learned is probably a bit too early to speak in terms of lessons learned, because we're still understanding some of the dimensions, is that incredibly on the plus side, countries were really able to set them up in very short time and make them work. And here again, I really want to pay tributes to everybody, to people, to have put us on safer grounds as individuals, and basically to make them work. And this is clearly then signaling in the rapid response that we have seen across countries. Of course, on the more challenging side is that whenever you are forced, if I can say so, to devise new mechanisms, to devise new norms, you don't really have the time to fine-tune them or to having them fully tailored. So and we have seen some of the challenges on that side as well. And for instance, we could see, and we can still see, the challenges placed by lockdowns and the restrictions that they impose, the challenges also cascading on business and the fact that business needed to close, but the necessity for governments to try to support business alive, because of course without business a community cannot sustain itself. So there are many social implications that derive from that one. Also, an important question on the use of emergency powers and the impact they had on the enjoyment of rights, which movements, just to mention one of them. And of course also the quite complex question between the management of a national emergency, as Honorable Sadr was saying, in synergy between the central government's institutions as well as the local governments. And this certainly will call for further reflection on how powers needs to be distributed in order to be mostly effective at the local level. I mean, Sendai framework clearly tells us that risk is local by nature, because it's defined by very specific characteristics that change from one place to the other, and in a way also from one individual to the other. But at the same time, of course, you need to also to have national measures. So how to combine this central government versus local level is something that's still in evolution. During the negotiation of the Sendai framework, that was a big issue, and I'm sure that it continues. It continues now. And overall, I think what we have been learning is that legal preparedness is really an important thing. And in this respect, I would really like to commend the work of the IFRC and the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and the national societies for the work that have been doing in this area. So, a lot to learn there, and certainly a long work going forward. Now, what we have been doing as with UNDRR was really to try to help countries in light also of the Bangkok principles for the implementation of the health aspects of the Sendai framework to either develop or strengthen the national strategies for the disaster risk reduction in a way to have them aligned to the Sendai framework, in particular to the scope of the Sendai framework, as Honorable Chaudhry was mentioning earlier. And what is really interesting is that the health aspects of the Sendai framework are very strong, because at the time of the negotiation of Sendai, Ebola was hitting a number of countries. So there was a very vivid conscience in the delegates that were negotiating the Sendai framework to really capture that dimension and making sure that it was included in the scope of the Sendai framework. And it is there. Biohazards are in the context, are in the scope of the framework in its paragraph 15. So going forward, there's a few points that maybe I would like to highlight. One is certainly to for our institutional frameworks to become more apt to address the current, but also the emerging challenges. This is a point that has been already made. So how we anticipate and how we use the science to inform the decision-making around the definition of laws, policies, bylaws, and etc. And the purpose is really to do it in a systemic manner, so that all state institutions and all of society engagement can be really ensured. We do know, we are learning that exclusion means vulnerability. So hence the importance of addressing vulnerability also from that perspective. Also the importance for the national frameworks to address all the variables that drives the creation of disaster risk, which are not only the hazard and its characteristics. So in this way, how we can influence the zoonosis, the transmission. So that is about the hazard. But how do we enhance also from the perspective of reducing vulnerabilities or reducing exposure? So normative frameworks, they really need to look at the four components of vulnerability, exposure, other characteristics, and capacity, which are encapsulated in the concept of risk by the Sendai framework. Of course, the full scope of hazard, so not managing hazard risk hazard by hazard, but in taking all of them and not limited to natural. aligning as much as possible to the Bangkok principles, the health emergency and disaster risk management framework developed by the World Health Organization, and of course in line with the international health regulations. And one challenge that probably is still existing is that very often disaster risk reduction is not defined as a clear legal obligation domestically. So there is certainly a need, and this is referred to the work of the International Law Commission. It's in particular in the draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters that does recognize this legal obligation. So that can, once recognized also domestically, it would be simpler also to define roles, responsibilities across institutions, but beyond that, because we do know that, as clearly stated in the Sendai framework, not only governments have the responsibility to manage disaster risk, all stakeholders and citizens, we also have to do our part in that. I would stop here, and again, very interesting to hear also the learning that India is already applying to its framework. Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you, Marcos. Thank you for your regional and global perspective. Very excellent. We are a lot of lessons to be learned from various countries' practices. So, so now may I now request Advocate Gaurav Kumar Bansal. You have been practicing law in the Supreme Court, and your focus areas have been on environment and disaster management. I think you have filed a number of public interest litigations before the Supreme Court to see that how the laws can be implemented in a more inclusive manner to promote the social justice and social protection. So over to you.
Thank you, sir. I express my gratitude to the DMICS for inviting me and to put my views as far as the legal and institutional framework of the disaster management in context of the COVID-19 is concerned. So I may sound sometimes different. So I'm really wish to say sorry in case I hurt any sentiments of anybody. But when we talk about this COVID-19 disaster, I really feel that we were talking of ourselves only. Why I'm saying this ourselves, like that is the human Homo sapiens, because out of the 8.1 million species, we are the only species which we are talking about this COVID-19 disaster in a sense that we were thinking that the temporary able person, and we are the temporary able right now, because nobody can guarantee that we are the only permanently able person. And because I am working on the issue of the social health, the mental health, the disability law, and the wildlife. What I feel that when we talked about this COVID-19 pandemic, we were talking about ourselves only. We literally get our focus is on ourselves, and that is the reason that we never talked about the wildlife, the effect of the COVID-19 on the wildlife, the effect on the COVID-19 on the disabled persons, the effect on the COVID on the mentally ill persons, etc. And that is the reason that I am saying that yes, we were talking about ourselves. As far as the a few of the examples which I wish to quote before the distinguished panelists is, then when we were talking about the COVID-19 vaccination, what happened that government introduced this COVID-19 vaccination as far as for this COVID pandemic, but where the focus was on the persons who are focus was not on the persons who were disabled, like the homeless persons. Till date, we don't have any kind of a guideline as when we talk about the COVID-19 vaccination of the mentally ill persons who are homeless. This is something which is very serious in nature, and we are literally out of literature as far as this aspect is concerned. Similarly, one more important thing which I wish to highlight, that what about the aquatic life when we talk about the COVID-19? We saw and it is a national news that at the point of this COVID-19, the near and dear ones of the victims, COVID-19 victims, they literally disposed of the bodies on the Gangaji, the national river, or on any river. So what is the effect of the bodies, and what is the effect of the aquatic life when the bodies of these COVID-19 victims get contacted with the water? So nobody talked about the same. Similarly, the wildlife. There are circumstances where the tigers throw dogs. They COVID-19 this virus get transmitted. So we are not talking about that also. So what we are talking about is of ourselves, and that too in ourselves category, quote unquote, we are talking about only and only the temporary able, that how we will get safe. This is something which is literally unfortunate. Now, when we talk about this COVID-19 under the Disaster Management Act, the one of the question which was that how this country deals with the COVID-19 under the existing legal and the institutional framework. When we fighted the case in the Supreme Court, the first of the instance, the first of the defense the Indian government did give in the Supreme Court is that this Disaster Management Act is not that kind of a disaster, is not that kind of a disaster which we framed under the Disaster Management Act. And the reason they provide is the disaster means a one-time disaster, and it was on the basis of those kind of a disaster that we put such we enacted the Disaster Management Act, or the disasters which are having the occurrence, and that too only the few occurrence like the earthquake, etc. So we were the government said that yes, as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned, we are not this disaster is not included as a notified disaster in the Disaster Management Act. We challenged this thing, and that was the reason. And the reason behind all of this exercise was that they were saying that under the Indian legislation, there is one section 12, subsection Roman 3 of Disaster Management Act, which provides for the ex gratia assistance. So at that point of time, the government notified the same, this COVID-19 pandemic as a disaster under the Disaster Management Act. The Indian government, what they did is they did an exercise of a pick and choose, because there is a provision under the Indian law that if the person died due to the disaster, then they have to provide a kind of a compensation to the families in order to provide a social security concept. And one more important thing, that our India and the Indian context, or under the Indian law context, the Disaster Management Act has been enacted by the Parliament using the concurrent list, which talks about the social security and the social insurance. So the moment social security is concerned, the role of section 12 Roman 3 comes in, which provides the ex gratia assistance. So what the Indian government did at that point of time, they said that okay, on the 14th of March 2020, they notified the disaster as a they notified this COVID-19 disaster as a notified disaster under the Disaster Management Act. But at the same time, they said that okay, we are notifying, but some of the provisions of the act will not come into the picture, because this disaster is not a kind of a disaster which we envisaged during enacting this act. So we challenged this thing, and we said that as far as the social security of the general public is concerned, it is the duty of the government to provide the ex gratia assistance. Luckily, on 30th of June 2021, we won this case, and after the intervention of the Honorable Supreme Court of India, and then the Supreme Court said no, there are some duties which the Union of India has to perform. And then they said, okay, you have the duty to provide the ex gratia assistance to all of the persons. Right now, as per the government data, the government is claiming that nearly 5 lakh persons have died due to this COVID-19. So all these families, all the 5 lakh families, you have to provide the ex gratia assistance. Then again, and as far as because earlier what is happening in the Indian law, that other notified disasters like the earthquake, etc., like the flood, etc., the Indian government is providing 4 lakh per person to families, providing 4 lakh per victim to the family member. But now in the case of COVID-19, the argument which was given by the government was that it's because of the fact that it is a day-to-day, there is a concept of the day-to-day expenditure, there is the concept of the day-to-day monitoring, there is the concept of the day-to-day change in the priorities, there is the concept of the day-to-day change in the method as well in the method in the day-to-day change in the modalities. So we are not going to treat this disaster as a disaster under Indian Disaster Management Act as far as ex gratia amount is concerned. So luckily, the Honorable Supreme Court of India, which is the apex court of India, they struck down this defense and they said, no, it is the duty of the government of India to provide the ex gratia assistance. Now the thing is this, that every person is has been provided by rupees 50,000 every family member for per death by the government of India. Now the thing is that whether this one of the question, the issue which has been raised by this in this conference is that whether the existing framework can be adapted to meet pandemic or similar challenges. I think that there is a need of some kind of, we have to rethink this issue, that when it comes to the pandemic, how we have to fight. Because of the legislature things and the complexities involved in such kind of things, there is a need to think that yes, there is a need to think that how we are going to fight if this kind of a disaster continues. At the same point of time, we have to learn. I have also learned from the NDMA website only that there is they have designated the biological national hazard as a disaster. So they have the rules there under. But at the same time, the government was saying in the Supreme Court, see, the disaster which we have envisaged is the kind of a disaster which is a one-time disaster. And in that too, we are lacking at many point of time on many issues. Sorry, like we are not talking about the wildlife. How the wildlife is like in Kaziranga, there is a Kaziranga National Park, and most of the time there is a flood. In each year there is a flood, and I'm sorry to say that again and again we are only centric about the temporary able persons. We are not talking about the wildlife. So the wildlife is getting a lot of wildlife is in lot of trouble because of the flood. Similarly, the when we talk about the COVID-19, the vaccination things, the marginalized society, the weaker society, the neglected society is not getting the this vaccination, and which is an important part of our this whole pandemic whole exercise, which we are saying that we have to fight against this. And the reason behind the same is that in my case only, in the Supreme Court, I draw attention of the Supreme Court that there are 44 mental health institutions in our country. And in those 44 mental health institutions, there are more than 20,000 persons who have the mental illness. And it was literally shocking that none of them was provided the COVID vaccination. So I raised this thing in the Supreme Court, and thanks again to the Supreme Court only that the Supreme Court of India directed this the Indian government, the government of India, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to please look into the issue, and they directed the government to provide the vaccination as soon as possible. And this is happening now. So what I am highlighting is that when we talk about the disaster and the preparedness about the disaster, we talk about ourselves, nothing else. And this is the thing which we have to take in which we have to rethink in future, that when there is a kind of such kind of a disaster, then what about the persons who are not wise? What about the species who are not wise as we are? Like the wildlife, like the vulnerable section of the society, the mentally ill, the person with disability, the with severe disabilities, and others. So time and again, these are the things which we learn also. So I am not accusing the government, but at the same time, when the government say that we have done this, we have done that, it's on paper. Most of the things remain on paper because of the implementation issue. And many of the time when the finances come into the picture, what I have learned that the government of any government, I am not talking about the Indian government, any government, what they did is they start doing the exercise of pick and choose, which is impermissible under the law of the land. So what is the uh, uh, right now the thing which we should do is that as far as this COVID-19 pandemic is concerned, or any other pandemic which may come in future, I hope so that there would be no pandemic, but in case there is a pandemic, there is a need to apply our mind to think about, we have to think out of the box, like we have to think about the vulnerable section, other sapiens also, like the wildlife, environment, plant, aquatic life, aquatic birds, all the aquatic animals also, birds, etc. And then we can have a full-fledged disaster management, because disaster management doesn't mean that the protection of the temporary able. Disaster management means that all the persons, all the sapiens who are getting affected by the disaster must get protected. And because we call ourselves wise, so we have the duty, we have the manifold duties to put all the things in order. And because the finances are involved, so what I wish to say is that at that point of when we talk about the disaster, we have to open our arms. We have to include the marginalized society, marginalized section of our society, the other species which are getting affected by the disaster. So I wish to stop here, but at the same point of time, I'm just taking a time, but because there is a member of parliament from Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, what happened, and this is that because of this thing, I have to approach the Delhi High Court. When there was the boundaries, international boundaries were locked. Most of the Indians were there in the Bangladesh and any other countries like Iran, Iraq, etc., USA, UK, etc. So I got a call on the through Twitter that, see, we are in Bangladesh and there are around 400 plus Indians. Most of them were Kashmiris. So they were saying that they were facing some problem because they were locked down in the Bangladesh and they were in the mess only, in their college mess only. And at that point of time, they were lacking of the basic fundamental things like the sanitary napkins. The girls were saying that we don't have the sanitary napkins. The girls were saying we are shortage of the eatable food, etc. So we requested at that point of time. I had nothing to do, but the thing which I did is I approached the Honorable Delhi High Court, and then the Delhi High Court directed the Indian government to talk to the Bangladesh government. And it was because of all this exercise that they returned. Now I got a call by a Kashmiri girl. She said that because of the government talk, we are in safe hand, and now we are in Kashmir. So I was just checking that whether Dr. Chaudhary, Sabir S. Chaudhary is in the Twitter or not. So I got his this account, and I am now following him also. But yes, had I met earlier, I think that he would be a very kind of a helpful person for us. So this is the thing which I wish to share, and I humbly say thanks to all of the panelists. Thank you.
So thank you, Gaurav. So now when we are talking of the whole of the government in the context of this legal framework, so we are not talking merely of the executive, but merely well talking of the judiciary as well, because sometimes the proactive intervention through the judiciary by advocates like Gaurav Bansal, it has made the system more inclusive by by providing facilities and broadening the facilities of social protection and inclusive disaster management. So thank you. Now the point is that you have all given a very excellent overview that what we are all doing. That's all very good. But the end result is that globally we have about nearly 4.5 million people have died in these pandemics. Now so many people, billions of people are affected, and now there is so much of disparity even in protection for the vaccination, etc. Now, did you not visualize? It was all right in the first pandemic of Spanish flu. That time systems were not developed and so on. But now we have the United Nations. We have this entire global framework. We are talking of transforming the world, the brave new world, 2030 development agenda. Now, what is going to be the impact of that? Now, why the question remains that why we could not anticipate this? Why could you not develop a robust for even at the national level? Why our legal system did not was not sound enough to develop a kind of an early warning for preventing this kind of disaster? It is pandemic, no doubt. It is once in a century event, no doubt. But we are also in the 21st century where science have advanced quite a bit. So there has been, to some extent, we must admit that there has been some failure, and this failure is going to have a tremendous impact over the implementation of the global agenda. Reducing mortality by half. But then you should take into account then where do you stand? It will have a very serious impact on the implementation of Sendai framework, on the sustainable development goals, and so on. So the issue arises is that whether really our legal system, our entire framework is good to prevent this kind of disasters, or we should have a relook into the system to see that this does not happen in future. And this also brings to the question whether national legislation is enough, or we should have a kind of a global laws, because the responsibilities are there to be fixed, where it originated, how it spread. So the entire global community is now deliberating on these issues. So now, second round of discussion. Then we don't have much time left, but very quickly, I'll go back to our panelists to say that what is the future of disaster management law? Do you think that we are all very fine that it is going on, or we need some changes? So I think one by one, there's some disturbance here. So I will not take much time, and I request, in the same order, to say a few words about the future of disaster management law and how the system can be improved further. Over to you, General Mendel.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, in this, a lot has been said, and especially Advocate Gaurav Kumar Bansal has covered a lot of issues which are the gaps today. I will give out a few areas which were found as gaps, which need more clarification, or some sort of clarity is required. The Act has created two parallel structures at the state level. One is a department level at the state level, or one is the State Disaster Management Authority. And hence, we have to find ways to bring the different constituents together and secure their support and participation. So, harmonizing the state authority and the State Disaster Management Authority is a challenge which needs to be spelled out slightly more clearly. Uh, COVID-19 and the resultant actions and legislations, orders, all those instruments whichever government has used to contain and to provide relief and succor to the population has given more depth to the fundamental right, that is right to life. And I think that should be also reflected in the Disaster Management Act in some way. Today, the Disaster Management Act does not talk about medical inclination of epidemic or public health emergency. So that can be added. The inclusiveness of marginalized section, vulnerable people, elderly, child care, the animals, livestock, stray animals, pet animals, all these are not part of it. During COVID, we have seen so many people leaving their pet animals on the road because they could not look after them and they were just left. So many pet animals, which included dogs and cats, and plus so many just send their cattle who they were milking otherwise because they didn't have food to give to them because of the lockdown or businesses being closing down. So there has to be something reflected in the act. Then climate-induced disaster. This word needs to be there because the IPCC 66 report has brought out too many red flags related to climate change and the anthropogenic activities related to it, which is causing the further deterioration of the climate change. And hence, I think climate-induced disasters, climate change in itself, should find a mention in the whole gambit. We have seen in this whole process that responders are not restricted to NDRF. Responders, police, you see, it was not NDRF which was visible everywhere. It was the police throughout the COVID to ensure the lockdown. They were braving the whole lockdown, coronavirus, and they were standing on the roads telling people to act in a certain way, channelizing them, motivating them. And you have seen so many WhatsApp videos coming, but it is nowhere there in their charter of duties. The role of police, role of central CAPFs, role of PMFs in the charter of disaster response, it needs to be, I think, legitimized in some way or other. We have seen that a large amount of actions were done by the NGOs, local level institutions, the Tehsil level, the civil society organizations, the urban local bodies, the Panchayati Raj institutions. So the Disaster Management Act in its present form becomes very weak when it comes to the district level, where it just forms a small mention. I think that is where the maximum strength should be given in the Disaster Management Act, because no matter what anyone says, whether it be at the central level, at the ministry level, at the state level, finally it falls on the district authorities to implement it.
So let us hear others.
Okay, sir. So I will finish here that definition of the disaster also needs to be more inclusive to include animals. And because of its broad definition, it lends itself to a lot of litigation. And hence, maybe a more specific definition is required. So I'll finish here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. And let me thank Gaurav for bringing up some excellent points. Gaurav, I'm now a DM away, so anytime you feel that you need to reach out to me, you're very welcome. Going back to your point, which I think is absolutely critical, you have raised the issue of how do we address global issues? That is really what we are talking about. And we have seen how multilateralism has been on the retreat over the past few years. We are now talking on the one hand about vaccination, and on the other hand, we are talking about vaccine nationalism. If you see how much of the vaccines have come to the developed world and how much has gone to the developing world, it is very clear. There is a new dimension on inequality. And even when it comes to climate change, we talk about science informing, shaping policy. The science has never been clearer, and yet action is not being taken. So I think, we have to come to terms with the fact that this is the only planet we have. We have to get things right. It is not just climate, it is also disasters. It is water stress, it is food security. It is how we consume our resources. If you look at currently how we are utilizing our resources, it's going to take 2 planet Earths to meet the resources of today. So these are global problems which require a global fix. And to get a global fix, you must have global solidarity. And only multilateralism can promote that. It is no point in Bangladesh perfecting the art of responding to disasters if other countries are going to be causing the disasters in the first place. Transboundary cooperation, regional solidarity, global solidarity. I think these are absolutely essential. And as I'm sure you are, because I think your question gives that indication, I think we are all disappointed with the way that the UN is delivering. So I think we have to look at reforms of the UN. We have to look at the international financial structure. We have to look at restructuring of debts. How can these countries pay all these debts? I feel that as a parliamentarian, these are issues which we have to address. And if you can imagine a scene, a typical river scene in Bangladesh, you see many boats dotted along. So if Bangladesh is the first boat to sink, it is only a question of time before all the other boats are going to sink. So we are not in this alone. And I think how we take that global solidarity forward. And President Biden has said, I personally have a lot of expectations. America is back, but America has to be back in action, not just in words. And we are looking forward to that. It's not just America. China has to come forward. India has to come forward. Russia has to come forward. Europe has to come forward. It is only through a new global compact that we can address these global risks and issues that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question, Mr. Marcos, for you. What is the impact of the global pandemics on the implementation of the Sendai framework? So would you please address this?
Yes, thank you. I think that we have a dual impact, if I may say so. On one side, clearly, if we look at it from the perspective of the achievement of the targets of the Sendai framework, we are having an issue because the volumes, the millions of people that have been impacted in terms of loss of lives, in terms of long-term impact, health-wise, job-wise, and so on and so forth. An environmental one is actually massive. So clearly, we may be facing a slowdown in the pace toward achieving the targets of the Sendai framework. At the same time, paradoxically, I really hope that the current crisis fuel further determination, strong political will to actually basically really address disaster risk reduction and prevention at the core of development, so that we have a clearly preventative strategies, not only in disaster management and in relief, but most fundamentally in our development strategies, our development models. And here I really want to stress also what Honorable Chaudhry was saying. International cooperation is really fundamental in all this, and we have no other option than strengthen that. And we can see, for instance, the impact of the pandemic on LDC countries and countries that least developed countries and countries that are trying to graduate. So we really need to look at our systems and how we can strengthen further international cooperation for the purpose of disaster risk management in such a comprehensive way. In that sense, I really invite you to carefully look at the draft articles developed by the International Law Commissions and now under the scrutiny of the General Assembly on this protection of persons in the event of disasters, because it really is about also international cooperation. Another important dimension that I feel is worth further considering is how we can establish reducing disaster risk as a legal obligation domestically. So that we really have stronger parameters on how action must be undertaken. Again, not only by the institutions, because we all have duties also as a citizen or through our civil society organizations that we are part to, and so on and so forth. And it is not only the executive that needs to act. So clearly, this is of interest of all the branches of powers. With the presence of Honorable Chaudhry, clearly we see the strong engagement of the legislative power, but also the judiciary has a fundamental role to play. And in that sense, another dimension that is really worth considering is science is progressing really at an incredibly fast pace. We know that integrating science into legislation is not easy, and legislative processes may take quite some time. So I think that is important to develop a further refined understanding of what are the best instruments from legislations to bylaws, policies, and etc. Depending on what are the instruments in any given country, and which one is best placed to incorporate the fast advancement of science and being for integration in action. So that is an important consideration also, what to module the different instruments. And finally, certainly also connected to this legal obligation to reduce disaster risk is the question of risk disclosure. So that risk is becoming more and more evident both in public and private transactions, and with legislation that can really help addressing the 4 dimensions of disaster risk. So not only the hazard characteristics and what we can do to make that impact, especially for man-made hazards, but also in terms of vulnerability, so that we better protect all the sectors of societies that are more vulnerable, either temporary or longer term exposures, and ultimately also the capacity of our people and fellow people and institutions. Thank you very, very much for having me here today. It was really exciting. I was really humbled by all the presentations. Thank you so much.
So there is a question from Mr. Mihir Bhatt. He says that there are legal and constitutional challenges on accessing and owning data on the risks. Risk information. The government has the monopoly on the data, and the data is not available to the general public. So how do you think we can make the access legally, the risk information legally very open and transparent for all the people, all the citizens? How do you communicate the risk to the people?
Is this a question for me, Doctor? Maybe you are mute, but maybe I can certainly other colleagues as well may wish to come in.
Professor Joshi. Professor Joshi is the
Sir, you are on mute.
Yeah. So Professor Joshi is the chairperson of the Center for Disaster Research in Jawaharlal Nehru University, a very prestigious university based in Delhi. He's also professor of the environmental sciences. So he had a background on the remote sensing and the satellite-based observation. So I would request him to take this question regarding data, because basically you have been, dealing with data of different types, remote sensing data and also the earth-based, ground-based data. And could you also please sum up the discussion, because this there is some disturbance here, so I will not take much time. Over to you, please.
Okay. Namaskar and good evening to all. So first of all, just going towards data. So as we all consider and we have realized, data is the oil of this modern century, and the kind of decision making which is there in disaster and non-disaster world, data is the necessity. And there are many options and there are many opportunities which have come nationally, globally, wherein the silos have been actually broken and data sharing is there. But still, we get to see that the sharing of data is not up to the magnitude and mark which is actually needed. So we need to come out beyond our comfort levels so that data could be used in a much more meaningful manner. So, it was, when I see today's session, it was a pleasure listening to all of you on the legal and institutional frameworks of data disaster management. Indeed, it was very interesting to see such a diverse viewpoints. But what I could read that we all have a very high degree of convergence. So when it comes to legal framework or institutional framework, both are a necessity and they are actually a prerequisite for the smooth functioning of any of the system. And these are more so very important when it comes to emergency or the disasters. So to me, disaster management is essentially a multi-stakeholder setup. And that means a structure which draws involvement of various relevant ministries, departments, administrative bodies, while having community at the center. The legal framework ought to provide the structures, functionaries, and activities. Those are actually, organized or operationalized in order to make the respective country disaster-free. This was very clearly mentioned by Mr. Chaudhary, when he was talking about legislation is good, but it needs to take in account the people and the community. So I also agree with what Mr. Marco and Dr. Chakravarti was mentioning. Legal arrangements are necessary, but the legal structure as is needed to cover wide range of issues. So, however, the application of its provisions has been very limited as of now. So, Disaster Management Act across the globe, we got to understand very much this during the pandemic. And as Mr. Gaurav, Mr. Gaurav Bansal shared, given the pandemic we have undergone, in due course of time and situation, the importance of relevance of disaster law is going to expand, and it need to be expanded. And to me, it should be done globally, with exceptions to few of the countries, like in the introductory remark, Dr. Dhar Chakravarti was mentioning about. And if we relook into this, so it might provide much dynamic and diverse points of views, which are actually needed today. So this may raise the responsibility and also confusion among many of the agencies which are there working, and maybe institutions about their role or maybe possible breaches. As you know, Major General Bindal was mentioning, India has actually set a wonderful example, both nationally and subnational initiatives, while bringing all kind of ministries, legislative instruments together during this pandemic. And the example of Andhra Pradesh, which he mentioned about, wherein, you know, enacting bodies or say panchayats, it has actually made a very significant difference and an impact in management of this pandemic. But we need to still go forward, maybe because the institutional frameworks of disaster management as of now appears essentially very hierarchical in their layout. So, however, you know, from the operational point of view, if you ask me, they need to be more with a very, what we call it, you know, flat bed or strong network, which can provide a very relational structure to make any country disaster free. So basically to break the silos, as Dr. Dhar Chakravarti was repeatedly mentioning about while referring, you know, to many of the points. And even Major General Bindal referred to it when he was referring to harmonization of some of the institutions. So as a phenomena, disasters are issues which impact all walks of life. We got to see it from many examples, including human beings, many of the life forms, many types of the ecosystems. So the present pandemic has very successfully taught us this across the globe. So the discussion and engagement of disaster with society require more analysis and probably a true reflection of the things. Similarly, you know, when we are very particularly looking at health-related disasters, so we need slightly different take, as Mr. Marco was mentioning, you know, people, their mindset, coordination, these all kind of things matter a lot. Though countries were able to set them up in this pandemic, still there is a need for a wide range of discussions and mechanisms to deal with these challenges and opportunities. To conclude, you know, I would say that to make the government machinery and private sector and society more sensitized about the multidimensional nature of disasters or multi-hazards, as we saw example from Bangladesh, many countries, including India, has, you know, similar kind of experiences. This was also, you know, emphasized by Honorable Home Minister of the country recently when in one of the gatherings he was mentioning about the multi-hazard nature. So wherein institutional capacity is developing, but it needs more pace and a variety, looking at the diversity of the disasters which are there, using both science, systematic mannerism, systems approach, and also very particularly which has emerged today is avoiding exclusion, which increases, you know, vulnerability to great extent. So take home message for me is, let's redefine and widen the definition or the term disaster while taking the risk into account, and disaster risk reduction needs to be legal obligation through a legal framework. It needs to be done globally with global institutions for sure, nationally, domestically, and probably across institutions and beyond that. Maybe, you know, having something called as multi-scale institutional framework. So I think there were a lot of learnings today, and I could just put them in such type of words today for our audience. Over to you, Dr. Dhar Chakravarti, please. Thank you. So I believe he's still on mute. So just to...
Yeah, we have exceeded our time. So there are a few questions, but we are not going to take this. So may I request Ovijit to give a formal vote of thanks.
Okay, thank you, sir. Before beginning the vote of thanks, I would request all the panelists to keep their video on, because the technical team shall be taking some photos, snapshots for the social media also. So I think the discussion today we had on this topic of legal institutional framework of disaster management in context of COVID-19 has been an enriching and informative experience for all the people who are working in the field of disaster management and disaster research. We have got to know that there is a need for normative structure. What should be the extent and scope of the normative structure which should be there in form of laws or regulations, and whether these normative structures are in themselves sufficient for effective translation into policy in practice, and what kind of steps are being required in that direction also. So we have also got how institutions are actually working, and how independent players and legal advocates have also played their role to ensure accountability and responsibility of government, and what kind of steps governments have taken in India as well as Bangladesh. We have got to came to know through the elocution of Major General Bindal sir as well as Mr. Sabir Chaudhary ji. So this has been a very enlightening experience for all of us, and has given points to discuss for classes and also for the disaster professionals who will be coming up over the period of time. So formally, I thank all the panelists who were here. I thank Major General Manoj Kumar Bindal sir for his very precise and very detailed discussion about what kind of steps have been taken by India, and more importantly, while in his second round, he has also highlighted what are the lacunas or what are the vacuums which has to be covered. So from someone who is holding institutional position and also reflecting on in such a manner is highly appreciative and commendable. So I thank sir for his wholehearted engagement today, sir. I thank Mr. Sabir Chaudhary ji for his enlightening lecture, wherein he highlighted that legal structures and normative structures are themselves not enough. The policy implementation and involvement of different sections and requirement of feedbacks and involvement is also very important. So I thank Mr. Sabir Chaudhary for his engagement in his second round. He told how global network is also needed. So we are also thankful to him for this. As far as Mr. Marcos is concerned, I think sir has very efficiently told what is the present structure we have and how that structure should be seen ahead. What should be the direction in which we should proceed, and what kind of global efforts as well as national or domestic efforts are also needed to harmonize these efforts. We thank you for your insights which you have provided us today, sir. We will be delighted to be enriched by your experience in forthcoming lectures also. And on behalf of SCDR also, we would like to invite all the panelists who have joined to enrich our students also about these things. Finally, I would like to thank Mr. Gaurav Bansal for the incredible effort which he has made in bringing up in the implementation of the statutory provisions related which are provided under Disaster Management Act, and also to take care of the different sections of society who have been deeply impacted by the current pandemic. In my classes also, I teach some of the cases which you have taken up over last 4-5 years, and we teach our students also about those cases. So it's good that somebody is taking up the issues related to Disaster Management Act as such. And I am thankful to Professor P.K. Joshi sir for his effective role in organization of this pre-conference webinar, and also for his very apt remarks wherein he concluded the session. So we are thankful to you, sir, and we are always guided by his very energetic personality in the center as well as otherwise also. And finally, I am very thankful to Dr. P.G. Dhar Chakravarti, sir, for his effort to organize and took up this important topic, which is very, very critical, and which shall play a very decisive role in a modern society which is run through a legal and institutional structure. So this is, and the question which he asked, that what is the future of disaster management law, is also very vital. So we are thankful to you, sir, and I am thankful to the technical team led by Parth and other participants from TAF Zara, who have effectively and very efficiently conducted the entire session, proceeding in a very, very professional and effective manner. So we are thankful to them also, and above all, we are thankful to all the participants who have joined today for the webinar. With this, I think I hope that the World Congress on Disaster Management proves to be a very big success. And this seminar, the points which you have taken in this pre-conference webinar is also deliberated and discussed in the seminar, in the conference also. So with this, I think we could conclude the session today. If any of you have any other points to make, sir, then we can observe, otherwise we will close. So, so should we close now?
Yes, with the
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. Sorry, there
Thank
was
you,
some
sir.
disturbance and some.